Every morning, he brought her a cup of water for a man who was never coming back. The distance between them was not measured in yards of dust or the length of the porch, but in the heavy, unmapped territory of what they both refused to say. Silas watched her from the shadows of the barn, his hands stained with the dark oil of a dismantled harness, his heart a hollow chamber echoing with the ghost of a life he had walked away from. Catherine stood at the edge of the yard, where the fence line met the infinite, swaying sea of grama grass, her eyes fixed on the northern horizon as if she could pull a moving speck out of the heat haze by sheer force of will. She was a woman built of waiting, her silhouette etched sharp against the bruised purple of the approaching dusk, and the tension between them was a physical weight, like the stillness before a summer storm that never breaks. He knew she was looking for a man who had been swallowed by the mountains 3 winters ago, and she knew he was a man who looked at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger he no longer trusted. The wind began its evening ritual, a low, rhythmic sigh that stirred the fine silt around Silas's boots. He didn't move, he simply existed in the periphery of her grief, a silent sentinel to a tragedy that wasn't his to claim, but was his to witness. He picked up a tin cup from the workbench, the metal cool and dented, and dipped it into the cedar bucket. The water was clear, reflecting the first pale star that had dared to pierce the overhead canopy of indigo. He walked toward the house, his spurs making a muted, rhythmic chime against the hard-packed earth. He didn't approach the porch directly. He stopped at the bottom step, offering the tin cup toward her without a word. Catherine turned slowly. Her face was a map of soft exhaustion, her skin parched by the same sun that had bleached the buffalo skulls in the coulee. She looked at the cup, then at him, her gaze lingering on the scars across his knuckles, reminders of a night in a border town he spent every waking hour trying to outrun. She took the cup, her fingers grazing his for a fraction of a second, a contact that felt like a spark in dry timber. She drank deeply, the silver water spilling a single drop down the side of her throat, and for a moment the vastness of the prairie seemed to shrink until there was only the sound of her breathing and the soft clink of the tin. She handed it back, her eyes meeting his with a silent, devastating recognition of their shared solitude. "He'll be thirsty when he gets here. The draws are all dried up between here and the peaks." Silas looked toward the horizon, where the mountains sat like jagged teeth against the sky. He didn't tell her that the snows had already closed the high passes. He didn't tell her that no man, however determined, could survive 3 seasons in the high timber with nothing but a horse and a dream of gold. He just took the tin cup and set it on the porch railing. "The well is holding," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "There's enough for those who come and those who stay." The weeks that followed were measured not by the calendar, but by the shifting angle of the light across the kitchen floor and the gradual cooling of the evening air. Life on the edge of the world required a brutal, repetitive grace. Silas mended the fences that the wind tried to tear down, and Catherine tended to the small garden that struggled against the alkaline soil. They moved around each other like 2 celestial bodies in a slow, careful orbit, never colliding, but always aware of the gravitational pull of the other. Every morning, before the sun had fully crested the rim of the world, Silas would find her in the kitchen, the smell of wood smoke and parched coffee beans filling the air. He would bring in the morning's haul of water, the bucket heavy and cold. He would pour her a tin cup of water, placing it on the scarred oak table while she worked the dough for the day's bread. It became a silent liturgy. The offering of the water was his way of saying he was there, that he saw her thirst, and that he would provide what he could to slake it. One evening, as the crickets began their rhythmic pulse in the grass, Silas found her sitting on the porch steps, her head bowed. The wind was high that night, whistling through the eaves of the house with a mournful, searching sound. He sat on the step below her, his back against the peeling paint of the pillar. He didn't look at her. He watched the way the moonlight turned the dust motes into tiny, drifting diamonds. "I can't remember the sound of his laughter anymore, Silas," her whisper. The admission seemed to cost her something vital, her shoulders sagging as if a brace had been removed. Silas gripped his knees, his muscles tight. He thought of the family he had left behind in the green hills of Kentucky, the faces he had erased from his own mind to survive the guilt of his wandering. He knew the agony of the fading ghost. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers for a long beat before he let it rest on the wood beside her. "The wind don't take what's buried deep, Catherine. It only scours the surface. What's real stays." "Is that why you're here? Because you're waiting for the wind to stop?" "I'm here because the world is wide, and I got tired of walking," he said truthfully. He looked at his hands in the moonlight. "And because some things are easier to carry when you aren't the only one holding the weight." She didn't answer, but she moved her hand an inch at a time until her pinky finger hooked into his. It was a small, tentative anchor. They sat that way for hours, two people suspended in the amber of a dying summer, watching the shadows of the clouds drift across the silvered plains. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of the things they were beginning to forgive in themselves. The autumn brought a change in the air, a sharp, metallic tang that spoke of frost and the coming iron grip of winter. The grass turned the color of an old penny, and the sky deepened into a hard, brilliant blue. Silas spent the days stacking cordwood against the side of the house, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing through the draw. Each log was a promise of warmth, a physical manifestation of a future he hadn't planned on having. Catherine spent more time watching him. She watched the way he moved with a deliberate, quiet competence, the way he spoke to the horses in a low, melodic murmur, and the way he always ensured the tin cup was full before he went to his bed in the barn. She began to leave a lamp burning in the window for him, not for the man who was never coming back, but for the man who walked across the dark yard every night. One afternoon, a dust storm rolled in from the west, a towering wall of red earth that blotted out the sun. The world became a claustrophobic, howling gray. Silas fought his way from the corrals to the house, his bandana pulled tight over his face, his eyes stinging. He burst through the kitchen door, covered in a fine layer of grit, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Catherine was there, standing by the stove, her face pale in the unnatural gloom. She didn't scream or panic. She simply took a cloth, dipped it into the bucket, and walked to him. She began to wipe the dust from his forehead, her touch gentle and certain. Silas stood perfectly still, the roar of the wind outside seeming to fade into the background. There was only the proximity of her, the scent of rain and old cedar, and the steady movement of her hand. "You shouldn't have gone out," she said softly, her thumb brushing the bridge of his nose. "The gate was loose," he rasped. "Didn't want the stock to scatter." She stopped her movements, her hand resting against his cheek. Her eyes searched his, looking past the guilt and the miles, looking into the quiet, steady soul of the man he had become in her presence. She didn't look toward the northern horizon. She didn't look for the ghost. She looked at the man standing in her kitchen, covered in the earth of the place they both occupied. "Silas," she breathed. He reached up, his large, calloused hand covering hers against his face. He felt the warmth of her skin, the life in her. He thought of all the reasons he should leave, the mistakes he had made, the blood on his past, the way he didn't feel worthy of a quiet life. But as he looked at her, he realized that the past was just a story told by a man he no longer was. The only truth was the dust on the floor and the woman in his arms. He turned his head,
and pressed a kiss into the palm of her hand. The wind rattled the windows, trying to find a way in, but the house held. They stood in the center of the storm, a small lit candle of human connection in a vast, indifferent dark. Catherine did not look toward the mountains. She only looked at him.